Hi guys, our group is the Chads and we read The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne, so this is our video project, so enjoy.
Okay, basically how our book started was the father had a dinner with Hitler leading to him getting promoted, which meant the father and the rest of his family had to move from Berlin to Poland, and their house was right in front of the Auschwitz camp.
So our rising action in this book would be Bruno, the main character, and his sister Gretel discovering the fence of Auschwitz that's right beside their house. This is the rising action because if they hadn't discovered it, I guess this wouldn't have our book climax wouldn't have happened. So basically one day they were in one of their bedrooms when they decided to look out the window, and that's when they found the fence. This kind of confused them at first, I guess, because they thought it was like a farm of some sort. But later on, Bruno decides to go explore, and that's kind of what leads into our climax of the book.
The climax that happened leading up to the ending was Bruno wanting to run away with Shmuel, so they make a plan to go into the camp and then leave, but they tragically died in the gas chamber.
The following action is Bruno's family looking for him after he went to the camp and died with Shmuel.
The resolution is after Bruno's death, his mother and his sister Gretel moved back to Berlin, and his father stayed behind at Auschwitz.
Bruno, our protagonist, he's 9 years old, and he's pretty innocent and pretty curious, and he's also very naive. He doesn't understand what the Holocaust is or what's going on, and so he confuses Auschwitz with Outwith, and he doesn't understand his father's job or why the people behind over the gate wear striped pajamas, and he also confuses Hitler with the Fury, and he's very curious, and since he moved to his new house, he's been very lonely, so he likes to explore a lot, and even after being told not to explore, he still explores all the way down to the gate until he meets Shmuel, his best friend. And a quote from page 213 is, Bruno found that he was still holding Shmuel's hand in his own, and nothing in the world would have persuaded him to let it go. And this shows how much he values his friendship with Shmuel, and how much loyalty he has.
The mother, I felt like, was very distant and quiet from the rest of her family. She obviously didn't really like the move from Berlin to Poland because she eventually convinced the father to move back. A quote I would say describes her is, "Mother kept very quiet during the day, having an awful lot of afternoon naps," page 188, and it just shows that she was very reserved and didn't really talk to anyone. Gretel is a protagonist in the story. She is the older sister of Bruno, who calls her the hopeless case. And her personality traits include her being bossy or rude to Bruno. And her being the older makes her understand more about why they moved to Auschwitz. And a quote from the book that describes her character is, "What are you doing in here?" shouted Gretel, saying that she's annoyed of her brother's presence in her bedroom on page 23.
So in this book, another character is Shmuel. Shmuel is our main side character in this book. As we read the book, it's very obvious to the audience that he's kind of the opposite of Bruno, I would say. For example, Bruno is very naive and gullible, and on the other hand, Shmuel, he's very serious and he knows the extent to what everything's going on during this war because he's one of the people in the camp. One quote said by him is, he's talking to Bruno and he tells Bruno that the fence is to stop people from leaving instead of for animals. because Bruno thought it was a farm. I feel like this quote shows kind of the contrast of both characters because they're both the same age, but because of their different living conditions, Shmuel is more like he has to face the reality of what like everything that's going on. Meanwhile, even though Bruno lives right next door, he's still very naive and he doesn't understand what's happening to his friend.
The father is more of an antagonist in the story, and like because of like the way he views Jewish people and how he supports Hitler's plans during that time. And a quote that describes him is he tells Bruno, "Those people, well, they're not people at all, Bruno," while referring to Jewish people at Auschwitz.
In the beginning of the book, Bruno lives in Berlin in a very large house with 5 stories. And he lives with a maid and a cook, and he lives a pretty good life. And to him, Berlin feels safe and familiar and structured. Bruno also has 3 best friends named Carl, Daniel, and Martin. And a quote from page 110, it says, "No, it's certainly not as nice as Berlin." And it just shows how much Bruno misses and loves Berlin.
The Boy in the Striped Pajamas took place in Berlin, 1942, before they moved, obviously. And their new house was 3 stories compared to 5, where they usually spent their time. And it wasn't as nice as the one in Berlin. And how Bruno described the new house was, the new house stood all on its own in an empty, isolated place, and there were no other houses anywhere to be seen. Page 11.
One of the settings in the book is Auschwitz, which is basically a camp where Bruno and his family like moved near to, and there's basically a big fence and like different buildings from a distance, which Bruno talks about in the book, and that's where he meets his friend Shmuel. And some quotes in the book that describe Auschwitz are, "Who would build such a nasty looking place?" said Gretel on page 32. Another quote is, "Who are all those people?" Gretel asked on page 35.
One theme in our book is kind of the relationship between Bruno, our main character, and Gretel, his sister. At the beginning of the book, we can obviously tell because they're siblings, they kind of hate each other because of their like age difference, I guess. One quote from the book is, "Bruno wasn't particularly bothered if Gretel was sent away because she was a hopeless case and caused nothing but trouble for him." At the beginning of the book, Bruno refers to Gretel as a hopeless case a lot. But towards the end of the book, before our ending happens, they kind of like start getting closer, like growing a bond. I guess maybe because they both realize like they're starting to like realize more of the reality about their parents and like the camp and stuff. Towards the end of the book, one quote that is said by the narrator of our book is, "Bruno wished that Gretel would sit down beside him and put her arm around him and tell him that everything was going to be all right."
Another theme in this book is the family's dynamic and how Gretel and Bruno view their father as a good guy and he's doing the right thing, but to other people like the mother and the grandmother, they don't like what he's doing and what he does for work. And an example of this is, "That's all you soldiers are interested in anyway, looking handsome in your fine uniforms, dressing up and doing the terrible things you do." Basically, that's what the grandmother said to Bruno's father, showing how like ashamed she is of what he does for work.
A metaphor used a lot in this book was Bruno comparing Gretel to a hopeless case without using like or as, saying there's no improvement for her. And he used this. He said she's a hopeless case, page 19.
So in the book, there's a lot of dramatic irony, which means when someone knows something, the character doesn't. And basically, Bruno doesn't know about like the Holocaust or why he moved to Outwith, as he calls it, Auschwitz. And so as readers, we know that the Holocaust is going on, and we know like the father's job is that he works with Hitler, but Bruno's very naive and he doesn't know. So
An example of a hyperbole used in the book is, well, because Germany is the greatest of all countries, said Bruno on page 112. This is an example of a hyperbole because he's basically saying how, like, Germany is better than all the other countries because before that, his friend Shmuel had said that he was from Poland, and Bruno said, oh, well, Germany's better. Yeah.
For literary devices, I chose to do similes. There's a good amount of similes in this book, but one of them that I chose is, as they left, they stood in a row together like toy soldiers. The context is they're talking about the soldiers at the camp, how they look like toy soldiers.
There's a good amount of analogies in the book, and a good example of this is the fence separating Bruno's house and the camp. It acts as a physical and symbolic barrier separating what Nazis thought at that time. But to Bruno, it's just a fence. But to the audience, it's more than just a fence and a symbol of how people view Jewish people during the Holocaust. And yeah.